Here's a rewritten version of the first part of the story in American English, tailored for an audience 40 and older, with compelling storytelling, vivid descriptions, and an engaging narrative that retains the core plot. The storm had raged through the Appalachian foothills all night, turning gentle streams into raging torrents and flooding the narrow roads winding through the wilderness. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a seasoned wildlife biologist, tightened her grip on the steering wheel of her aging SUV, the windshield wipers struggling to clear the relentless downpour. She had spent the past hour navigating through waterlogged roads, eager to return home after a long day at the university. As she neared Whispering Creek Bridge, something unsettling caught her eye. A flurry of frantic movement near the roadside culvert. At first, she dismissed it as debris caught in the current, just another casualty of the storm. But then came the sound, the harsh, insistent cawing of crows. A murder of at least 6 crows had gathered in a chaotic, flapping mass, their dark forms silhouetted against the storm-lit sky. They dove and pecked mercilessly at something half-submerged in the water, something small and struggling. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Predators at work. She slowed the vehicle, pulling onto the muddy shoulder. Through the sheets of rain, she could just make out a sodden, trembling form pinned against the metal grate of the culvert entrance. Her breath caught. It was a bobcat cub, tiny, helpless, and barely keeping its head above the churning floodwaters. Then she saw it. A particularly bold crow swooped down, striking at the cub's head with its sharp beak. The creature flinched, but made no sound, too exhausted to fight back. Another crow landed, its beady black eyes fixed on the helpless animal, waiting for its turn to strike. Eleanor didn't think, she acted. Shoving the gear into park, she grabbed her raincoat and flung open the door. The cold rain hit her like a slap, soaking through her clothes instantly, but she didn't care. "Hey, get out of here!" she shouted, waving her arms. The crows burst into flight, cawing angrily as they retreated to the low-hanging branches, watching her with sharp, calculating eyes. But Eleanor had no time to spare for them. She dropped to her knees in the cold, rushing water, mud seeping through her jeans as she reached toward the trembling cub. It was in terrible shape, soaked, shivering uncontrollably, its head tilted at a strange angle. Small, bloody wounds dotted its face where the crows had pecked relentlessly. One eye was swollen shut. It was barely breathing. Eleanor swallowed hard. The cub had no chance out here alone, and yet, somehow, it was still fighting to stay afloat. Eleanor knelt beside the trembling bobcat cub, rain dripping from the brim of her hood as she studied the fragile creature before her. It was barely clinging to life, its frail body shuddering with every shallow breath. The cruel downpour had reduced its spotted fur to a soaked, matted mess, and fresh peck wounds marred its tiny face. One swollen eye remained tightly shut, while the other, half open, held no recognition, only a distant, dazed glaze. It was fading. The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver down Eleanor's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She clenched her jaw, knowing exactly what nature's verdict would be. Predators didn't wait for weakness, they took advantage of it. The crows had nearly finished what the storm had started. If she walked away now, they would return, pecking at the helpless cub until there was nothing left but bones. She had seen it before. That was the way of the wild. No second chances, no mercy. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. Every instinct she had as a biologist told her to walk away, to let nature take its course. She had spent decades studying the delicate balance of predator and prey, had lectured students about the dangers of human interference in the wild. The moment she reached out and intervened, she was crossing a line she had always sworn to respect. Yet, as she watched the cub struggle to keep its nose above the rising water, its tiny body shaking from exhaustion, something deep inside her rebelled. This wasn't a predator taking down its rightful prey. This wasn't the strong surviving over the weak. This was a baby, swept from its mother's side, left defenseless, and now brutally attacked by opportunistic scavengers. This was a tragedy unfolding before her eyes, one she had the power to stop. A car rumbled past, headlights flickering across the drenched pavement. The driver slowed, peering through the storm. You okay, ma'am? Eleanor instinctively shielded the cub from view. Yeah, she called back, voice steadier than she felt. Just checking something in the drainage. The car hesitated, then drove on, its taillights vanishing into the mist. She looked back down at the cub. I can't leave you here. The thought struck with such clarity that it nearly startled her. Eleanor exhaled sharply, reaching out, her hands usually so steady as she scooped the sodden creature into her arms. The cub weighed almost nothing, a fragile collection of damp fur, trembling muscle, and sharp little bones. It didn't fight, didn't make a sound. Just one golden eye, clouded with exhaustion, flickered open and met hers. Not trusting, not afraid, just existing. I hope you're a fighter, little one, she murmured, cradling it close to her chest. Because you're going to need to be. Eleanor drove through the storm with one hand gripping the wheel and the other pressed against the small bundle wrapped inside her raincoat. The cub barely stirred. Its breathing was weak, its fragile body radiating an alarming lack of warmth. Every few seconds, she glanced at it, watching for the slightest movement, anything to assure her it was still alive. The Mountain Ridge Veterinary Clinic was 30 minutes away, but she didn't have that kind of time. Every instinct told her the cub wouldn't survive the drive. If she wanted to save it, she had to act now. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was still heavy with the remnants of the storm. She sprinted inside, ignoring the puddles her soaked boots left on the wooden floor. With practiced urgency, she grabbed a thick fleece blanket, wrapped the cub snugly, and placed it beside a heating pad set to low. The dim glow of her bedside lamp cast soft shadows as she knelt beside it, studying its pitiful form. The cub's ears twitched slightly, but it remained deathly still, its ribs rising and falling in faint, uneven gasps. Too weak to fight, too weak to cry. Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed. "Ellen, it's me." The line crackled for a moment before a groggy but familiar voice answered. "Eleanor, what's going on?" "I found a bobcat cub," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Head trauma, hypothermia, signs of neurological damage. It's barely breathing. A heavy sigh from the other end. "Eleanor, you know how these cases end." "I know," she snapped, "but I couldn't leave it there. What do I do?" A pause. Then Ellen's tone softened. "All right, start slow warming immediately. Not too fast, or you'll send it into shock. Fluids subcutaneous if you can manage. Keep it hydrated, but don't force food yet. If it makes it through the night, call me." Eleanor hung up and got to work. Her hands were steady as she prepped the supplies. A warm saline drip, a tiny syringe, a delicate needle. She had done this before with injured wildlife, but never with something so small, so broken. She inserted the needle just beneath the cub's skin, whispering softly, "Come on, little one, stay with me." The hours crawled by. Every 15 minutes, she checked its breathing. Every hour, she administered fluids. Twice, she caught herself holding her breath, fearing the next exhale might never come. Sometime after midnight, as exhaustion threatened to pull her under, she saw it, a flicker of movement. The cub's good eye cracked open just a sliver. A weak, almost imperceptible swallow. A sign, not of strength, not yet, but of fight. The night stretched on in agonizing silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the soft, shallow breaths of the tiny creature cradled in Eleanor's makeshift ICU. She sat beside the plastic storage container she had repurposed into a recovery bed, her tired eyes fixed on the bobcat cub's fragile frame. It hadn't moved in hours. A deep fear gnawed at her, the kind that only came with watching over a life teetering between existence and oblivion. She had done everything she could, administered fluids, regulated the warmth beneath its frail body, monitored every labored breath, but the truth loomed over her like a storm cloud. It still might not be enough. She rubbed her face, exhaustion pressing down like a weight. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed, 2:47 a.m. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall asleep, but her body had other plans. She jolted awake at 4:12 a.m., panic lurching through her chest. Had she slept through something? Had the cub's weak grip on life finally slipped? Heart hammering, she leaned over the enclosure, holding her breath. And then, movement. Just the slightest shift, a twitch of a whisker, the faintest flutter of an eyelid. But it was there, a sign of life. Eleanor exhaled, her muscles unclenching. The relief was immediate, but so was the fear. This wasn't victory. It was just a flicker of hope in a sea of uncertainty. She reached for the small syringe filled with a nutrient-rich formula Ellen had given her, careful not to jostle the cub as she tilted its head ever so slightly. She placed a single drop onto its tongue and waited. Seconds passed. Then a weak, almost imperceptible swallow. Tears stung her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. She reached for her phone and dialed. Ellen, she whispered when the veterinarian picked up. He swallowed. There was a pause, then a sigh. That's unexpected. A beat. Keep going, Eleanor. Slow and steady. If he's still responsive by morning, we may have a chance. Eleanor hung up and settled into her chair. She wouldn't sleep again tonight. But for the first time since she had pulled the cub from the storm, she allowed herself to hope. The days that followed were a relentless battle. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Eleanor devoted every waking moment to the cub's fragile existence. The once soaked, shivering bundle had a name now, Theo, though he was still too weak to acknowledge it. His survival hung by a thread, and she wasn't about to let go. She fed him in measured, painstaking increments, using a tiny syringe to deliver small, nutrient-rich doses. Some days, he swallowed easily, a flicker of progress that sent hope soaring in her chest. Other times, he refused, his little body stiff and unresponsive, and Eleanor had to fight the suffocating fear that she was only prolonging the inevitable. Then came the tremors. It started one evening as she adjusted the blankets around him. A sudden jerk, then another. His tiny limbs stiffened unnaturally, his muscles twitching in erratic spasms. Eleanor's breath caught. Seizures. Her hands moved on instinct. She reached for her phone, already dialing. "Ellen?" she said, voice tight with urgency. "It's happening." "Describe it," the vet answered, her tone shifting to clinical precision. Eleanor did, her heart pounding as she watched Theo's small body tremble. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to send terror curling in her gut. "Stay with him," Ellen instructed. "Keep the room dim, reduce noise, and if it doesn't stop within a few minutes, bring him in immediately." Minutes passed like hours, but eventually the tremors subsided. Theo lay limp, his breathing shallow but steady. Exhausted but alive. Eleanor slumped back in her chair, emotionally drained but unwilling to surrender. The days blurred together, nights spent dozing in a chair beside his enclosure, alarms set for every 2-hour feeding, moments of quiet desperation when his body refused to cooperate. Then, one morning, a small miracle. She had just finished cleaning a fresh wound near his ear when Theo suddenly did something he had never done before. He jerked his head away. Not in pain, in resistance. A shaky, defiant motion that sent a surge of relief crashing through Eleanor like a tidal wave. For the first time, he was fighting back. The first real sign came early one morning, just as the sun crept over the treetops, casting golden light through the screened porch where Theo now lived. Eleanor had spent the past few weeks nursing him through setbacks, each day a delicate balance between cautious hope and crushing doubt. But today, something was different. She sat quietly, watching from the doorway as Theo stirred in his enclosure. His coat, once dull and matted, had begun to regain its natural luster, the distinctive spotted pattern standing out against the tawny fur. His posture had changed too, less fragile, more assured. He was still small, still carrying the slight head tilt from his neurological damage, but there was a new sharpness in his gaze, something wilder, more alert. Then it happened. A crow landed on the wooden railing just beyond the screen, a big one, sleek and black, its feathers catching the morning light. It cawed once, tilting its head, eyeing the enclosure with curiosity. Theo went completely still. Eleanor's breath hitched as she watched the transformation. His ears flattened, his body lowered into a crouch, every muscle in his small frame tight with focus. He was no longer the trembling, near-lifeless cub she had pulled from the storm. In this moment, he was something else entirely, a predator. Slowly, instinctively, Theo shifted his weight, his golden eyes locked onto the bird, calculating, waiting. The crow, oblivious to the predator on the other side of the mesh, fluffed its wings and preened, completely unaware of the lesson Theo was teaching himself. Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, awe, a tinge of sadness. She had spent weeks saving this little life, keeping him alive with gentle hands and careful care. But now, watching him slip into his instincts so effortlessly, she understood something deeper. She was not raising a pet. She was raising a wild thing. Theo inched forward, his tail flicking ever so slightly. The crow suddenly startled, flapping its wings, launching into the sky with a sharp caw. Theo lunged forward, paws hitting the edge of the screen, claws extending in a swipe that just barely missed the retreating bird. He landed awkwardly, his balance still imperfect, but Eleanor saw no frustration in him, only determination. And for the first time, she wondered what it would mean when the day came that she could no longer keep him. Eleanor had known this moment would come. She had always known. Yet, standing on her porch, watching Theo prowl through his enclosure with growing strength, the weight of the decision pressed down on her like a stone. For weeks, she had poured herself into saving him. Every feeding, every late-night vigil, every setback and victory. She had held him through the worst of it, watched his tiny body fight for life, and now she saw the undeniable truth. He wasn't hers to keep. The problem was, he also wasn't ready for the wild. Theo was strong, yes, but not strong enough. The neurological damage had healed as much as it could, but it left subtle remnants. A slight tilt to his head, a moment's hesitation before a pounce, an occasional misstep when he landed from a jump. In the wild, that hesitation could mean death. She could keep him. It was the thought that haunted her, curling around her in the quiet moments when she let herself imagine a different future. She had the space, the knowledge, the patience. He was bonded to her now in ways neither of them had chosen. She could build a larger enclosure, give him more freedom, ensure he never had to fend for himself. But that wasn't the life he was meant for. Eleanor tightened her grip on the mug in her hands, its warmth doing little to comfort her. Across the yard, Theo was stalking a bundle of leaves, his body low, his gaze focused, tail flicking in quiet concentration. Wildness burned in him, in his movements, in the way he had begun resisting her touch, in the way he no longer looked at her for comfort, but instead looked beyond her, toward the trees. The decision had already been made. She had just been delaying it. She heard Ellen's voice in her head, gentle but firm. "You saved his life, Eleanor. Now give him the best one he can have." With a steadying breath, she reached for her phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. "Margaret, it's Eleanor." She swallowed hard. "I have a bobcat for you." The words felt like ripping something out of herself. But they were the right words, and she knew it. The morning of the transfer arrived too soon. No amount of preparation had made it easier. Eleanor had spent the night gathering everything Theo would need for the journey. His favorite blanket, a soft towel lined in the carrier, and a detailed record of his care, documenting every feeding schedule, every medical treatment, every small victory he had fought for. She had even written a letter for his future caretakers, explaining his quirks, his preferences, the things that made him who he was. But nothing could prepare her for the moment she would have to say goodbye. Theo sat inside his enclosure, watching her with those golden eyes that had once been dull with exhaustion, but now gleamed with a quiet intelligence. He had grown so much. Stronger, sharper, wilder. Yet, he was still marked by his past. The slight tilt of his head, the hesitation in his movements, the lingering effects of the injuries he had fought so hard to overcome. Ellen arrived first, bringing a mild sedative to ensure the transition would be as stress-free as possible. Eleanor held Theo one last time, feeling the warmth of his body against her chest, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breath. It was impossible to believe that the same fragile creature she had pulled from the storm was now this fierce, living testament to resilience. "You sure you want to take him?" Ellen asked softly. Eleanor nodded. "I need to see where he's going?" The drive to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center was long and quiet, the winding roads cutting through endless stretches of forest. Theo barely stirred, his body heavy with the sedative, but Eleanor knew he could still sense the world moving around him. When they arrived, Margaret, a silver-haired woman with years of experience in wildlife rehabilitation, greeted them warmly. "We've prepared a special space for him," she said, leading them to a spacious enclosure carefully designed with climbing structures and hiding spots. Eleanor swallowed hard. It was more than she could ever have provided for him. As she set the carrier down, she whispered, "You're going to be okay, Theo." She wasn't sure if he could hear her. But as she turned to leave, she felt it. The weight of what they had shared, the undeniable truth that their paths had crossed for a reason. And Theo, in his own way, would carry that forward. Some stories are not just about survival. They are about connection, compassion, and the choices we make when faced with the fragile beauty of life. Eleanor didn't set out to rescue a wild animal, nor did she expect that saving Theo would change her forever. But it did. Theo's journey was a reminder that kindness does not weaken nature's balance, it strengthens it. Too often, we see the wild as something separate, something untouchable, something to be feared or left to its own devices. But there are moments, rare and powerful, when stepping in is not an interference, it is an act of responsibility. We do not own the wild, but we are part of it. The creatures that roam our forests, soar above our skies, and prowl in the shadows are not invaders in our world. They belong here, just as we do. Theo's story is not just his own. It belongs to every animal struggling to survive in a world shaped by human hands. We owe them respect. We owe them care. And when the moment calls for it, we owe them the courage to help. Because sometimes saving one small life creates a ripple far beyond what we ever imagined.